So one of the things we did not talk about last time when we began John 6 was how this particular miracle is in all of the Gospels. So the three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and also here in John. It's a little bit different in John, some of the details that we get. And part of what we'll be looking at is why, not so much why are some of those different, but in what way they're different theologically. And why we think John may have written about this same event in a slightly different way than the synoptic gospels did. None of it contradicts anything. It's just a different kind of look at it. And what John likes to do, especially with the miracles, is to somehow, it seems, connect the miracle with some theological idea that either before or after the event he's connecting it to. One thing we want to be looking at as we're talking about this miracle that happened isn't so much the miracle as it is, sorry, I'm trying to gather my thoughts. When I'm rushed like this morning, that's hard for me to do. We had a voters meeting at Zion today, and just so you know, we're having one today too here. One of the things we want to be thinking about as we're looking at the feeding of the 5,000 in John is what possible theological connections might it have? If we're talking about feeding people, what might your early guesses be? That a theological meaning that deals with feeding people. Okay, and since we're talking theological, let's do spiritual. So, how do we get fed spiritually? Okay, there are basically two words, or two things: the Word and the sacrament. And so, which of those two do you think, or both, might we want to be thinking about when we're talking about the feeding of the 5,000? You'd say both. Did you say both?
I said, I guess more the sacrament.
More the sacrament? When we are looking at the Gospel of John, and it begins with that whole sequence in chapter 1 about Jesus being the Word, you can't really ever, when we're talking Jesus in the Gospel of John, set that aside. And so he is the Word made flesh and dwelling among us. Okay, that's not going to change ever. From the time that he was conceived, he's both God and man. So he took on human flesh. John 1 calls him the Word made flesh. So we are looking at the Word from that point of view, and also the words that he speaks here, and especially what he speaks following this miracle. I think we ended last time with the idea that people are following Jesus possibly for the wrong reasons, or in line with that, they're waiting for the Messiah, but they have the wrong idea about what the Messiah is going to be, or what they think it should be. So the biggest oppressor right now at that time was Rome. And so they're looking to get rid of their oppressors. Kind of brings to mind all kinds of other things in their history, especially the Exodus. Who were their oppressors at that time? Egypt. And what did God do? He delivered them. So what are people looking for in terms of a Messiah? That God will deliver them from their oppressors. And can he do that? Yes. Is that why Jesus came? But they don't know that. He keeps telling them who he is and why he came, but they don't want to hear it, because if you get something set in your mind, do you want to hear an alternative? Okay, so that's kind of where they're at in their thinking. Yes, we're waiting on a Messiah. Could this be the one? If it is, hopefully he will remove Rome from our presence, defeat them, whatever. But that's what's on their minds. And so here's this guy, and he's doing all these miracles, and he's healing people. And could this be the one? But they're not thinking, could this be the one to save us from our sins? They're not thinking that. Could this be the one to drive out Rome and make us a great nation again? Kind of thing. You know, that's never far from them. I think we need to understand that. It's never far from them to be thinking, we are sons and daughters of Abraham. And that's what matters. And so, very difficult for them to be thinking, we are to give all of our trust to this Jesus. Is it difficult for us? Give all our trust to Jesus. After hearing today's sermon, you'll probably be thinking about that very question. I don't ask it in the sermon, but I'm asking it now. And in the sermon, you'll hear about all kinds of things that we deal with in this life that could cause us to have difficulty placing all our trust in Christ. All right, so just a read through again, quickly, 1 through 15, just so we kind of get our bearings again. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, that's an important clue, the Passover. The feast of the Jews was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So there it is. Now I'm not going to do this mainly for the sake of time, but I encourage you to do it, to read in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this same account. Okay, and it's easy enough looking in your Bibles to see in the notes where in those Synoptic Gospels you can find this same account. But it's going to look different. One of the things that John does, and when you look at those, you'll notice this, in the Synoptics, kind of at least part of the focus is on the disciples. I mentioned last week that Jesus says in the Synoptics, "You go and get them something to eat." But here he doesn't say that, does he? So that's left out here in John's gospel. And instead, who's the focus on? All the focus is on Jesus. Did you notice this? It's more noticeable if you read the Synoptic Gospel accounts, because that's where it looks really different. There's so many things here that when I was reading the commentary, it was just mostly what the commentator wrote about, the connection to things like the 23rd Psalm, the connection to the Lord's Supper, especially that one. He spent many a page talking about the connection to the Lord's Supper. Was this meant to be that? I think when we read further in John chapter 6, it's very hard to not make that connection. When Jesus talks about himself being the bread of life, and they have such a hard time with the words that he's saying about himself, that many at the end of the chapter are leaving, no longer following him as disciples. That's where he asks the question of the 12, do you also want to leave? I mean, that's a really good question for us. Do we also want to leave? Because at times we hear a word from Jesus that we don't like, or we have a hard time with, or we think, we have this picture of Jesus in our minds, like the one going down the stairs to the basement of Jesus carrying back the one lost lamb. Sometimes that's our picture of Jesus, and then we read a text where he says something difficult, and we're like, those two can't be the same guy, except it is. When people have the idea of my Jesus, have you ever heard anyone say that? Well, my Jesus wouldn't do that. My Jesus wouldn't say that. you're wrong already when you start saying, my Jesus. We don't get to make him whatever kind of Jesus or Lord that we want. Okay? Which is why it's so important for us to be answering the question, who is he? It's why he keeps asking his disciples, the closest ones, who do people say that I am? Because they're all getting it wrong. They might get one aspect of Jesus sort of correct. He's one of the prophets. Well, what are they thinking here? I just read it. They said that. This is the prophet. Okay, this might be the Messiah. Okay, what does that mean? What is the Messiah supposed to be? What is he supposed to do? And there's the other question we have to answer. Why did God send him? To do what? To accomplish what? What do they keep wanting to see? And Jesus is going to call them out on this right after when he crosses the lake there, the sea. And they're all waiting for him on the other side. And he calls them out about why they're following him. They want to see more miracles. What's the next thing he's going to do? This is not why he came. He did not come to be a showman and show them what powers he has, what tricks he can do. All right. So notice in verse 4 it says, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. In part, that's to give you the answer to when. When is this taking place? Okay, so we know what time of year. If the Passover is at hand, we know what time of year. And every year the Jews celebrated the Passover. Interesting then that they're not, especially Jesus, in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And yet what happens at the Passover? Like, what do they do ritually? It's a reminder to them of a meal that the Lord had them do before the Exodus, before the coming of the angel of death, the last plague on Egypt. And that night, he had very specific instructions of what they were to do and what to do with the blood of the lamb, which kept them safe, and then they were not only delivered from the angel of death, but delivered from Egypt and slavery there. And God brought them out. And then, as they're wandering through the desert for 40 years, he reminds them who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, again and again and again, to remind them of that deliverance that God did for them. So the Passover is a very important, and I want to say it with this word, meal. It's a festival, a meal to remember God's deliverance. And so they have all kinds of readings along with this meal to help them remember what God did for them. Well, they're not in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover this time. Where does it say they are? Verse 1 tells you, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Interesting, those two names, and it's caused commentators a lot of grief, but when Jesus has risen from the dead later in John's Gospel, chapter 20, I want to say, and this is when he has breakfast with them, and they have fish on the beach. and Jesus restores Peter. There, I believe also it's called the Sea of Tiberias. So same place, different side of that sea. So that gives you an area, a general area. Problem is, in verse 3, it says Jesus went up on the mountain. Well, there's not really mountains like right there. So more likely it should be translated like hills or hillside. Do we use that interchangeably? I know I did in Rapid City. We call it the Black Hills, but to me, when you're driving up them, it's like mountain. And I've driven on mountains too, but the elevation isn't as high, but you can tell a difference when you're breathing, when you're standing at the top of the. So we can sort of use it interchangeably, but it's not really mountain, probably where they're at. But hills, that you're going to notice a difference in elevation. And it says there he sat down. So this brings to mind phrases like reclined at table with them. Okay, they sat down to a meal. Reclined at a meal. Notice one of the other descriptions that it gives. It's a little bit later on, but verse 10, where Jesus says, have the people sit down. He said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in that place. And then it says, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. So there's where you get your number. What's it tell you, or what's it bring to mind when it says there was much grass in that place? There's nothing necessarily theological that there was much grass in that place, but maybe it evokes something. Maybe John was wanting to evoke something when you read it. This is where I think the 23rd Psalm comes into play. Okay. Green pastures. And he leads you there. And in this case, you sit down there to do what? Have a meal. Well, there's nothing to eat for this banquet. Got to have food at a banquet, right? What do they have? 5,000 people, well, 5,000 men. John doesn't mention about women and children, but I bet they're there too. So there's 5,000 men, and he wants them to sit down. And what they're asking is how we're going to feed all these people. Jesus doesn't say send them away. In the Synoptics, the disciples inquiring of Jesus are asking him, do you want us to send them away? And in the Synoptics, Jesus says, no, you get them something to eat. But here's the problem. I said it last week in terms of math. Do the math, it's not going to work out. The question I always get with funerals, especially if we have a funeral luncheon, how many people will there be? You think I know that? I never know that. Especially if I didn't know the family well. How many will come? The family doesn't even know. Here we have a number. And, I understand the question because you're trying to figure out how much food that you're going to need to serve them. Same question here, how much food? We don't have enough. That's the reality. But have you ever known our reality to be something that gets in the way of what God can do? And that's really part of the point here. You know, the whole, what the angel Gabriel told to Mary. Nothing is impossible with God. And so who do we have here? They don't understand that. They don't understand who they have there. They don't know what he's capable of. They have seen, from what our text is saying, that he's done some other miracles. They've probably heard of ones they didn't see, and they want to see more. They want to come hear him because he says these strange things. What's he going to say next? They don't know what they have or who they have right in front of them. Is this miracle, or any of them really, why Jesus came? Is he there to show them who he is with these miracles? What do you think? Who said that? What'd you say, Jim?
No.
Jim says no. Why do them?
I guess you'd have to bring attention to something.
You know, at times it seems like he doesn't want to do that. Tell no one what you just saw.
Yeah, but they do.
So are you saying Jesus knows they're going to anyway? Why bother telling them not to? These people are going to do whatever the opposite is of what I tell them to do. It's probably right.
Here's how I look at it. It's kind of like the whole Santa Claus thing, believing is, seeing. Seeing isn't believing. So that's kind of how I put it with even Christ and miracles that he does, You believe because you believe, not because you're seeing him do those things.
Right.
Then that necessarily.
That's how it should be for us.
Yes.
But we tend to look at it in that way with, I need to see in order to believe. And Scripture says different. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. He did not come to show them how awesome of miracles he could do. But he does them in part to demonstrate what he's teaching them about himself. And so that's why I like the Gospel of John in part, because of what I said earlier. When he's doing these miracles in the Gospel of John, it often seems to be attached to, either before it or after it, a theological theme of some kind that he's trying to teach. And this is no different. You'll see it in the rest of this chapter especially. So there's a boy there, and here's the math part. 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. And, Andrew, I think, in our math, correctly assesses what are those for so many people. Here on one side of the ledger, we have 5 loaves and 2 fish. Here on the other side of the ledger, we have 5,000 people to feed. It doesn't square. But add to the equation Jesus. Those numbers mean nothing. They could have had 10,000 people or more, and no bread or fish. When Satan tempted Jesus in the wilderness, what was the first temptation? Remember, Jesus had been fasting 40 days. He's tired. It's the desert, so it's probably really hot, like Missouri in July. Except desert, so arid, dry heat. And he's hungry, and he's weak, physically. And Satan tempts him, knowing who he is, change these stones to bread. What's the point of me bringing that up? Could he? So when I say he didn't need 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, because he could have generated that from nothing. We have 5 loaves and 2 fish, some boy who was there, so we know there are others besides 5,000 men. What does Jesus do? It says in verse 6, he already knew what he would do. At that point, we're not let in on what he will do yet, and neither were they. So it's a matter of trust, isn't it? When he performed the first miracle, changing water to wine at the wedding in Cana, we've already talked about that miracle. What did Mary, his mother, say to the workers? Do whatever he says. And who's the he? Jesus. What should they be doing? Whatever he says. And so should we. And the first thing he says is, have the people sit. There was much grass in that place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Verse 11, Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. In the synoptics, you'll find that the disciples distribute it. What's it not saying? Yeah, that's a terrible question at this moment. When I do the words of institution, what are those? He took bread. And what did he do? He gave thanks, but he broke it. What's it not saying here? He broke it. But we know that he did because the bread is in pieces that they gather up, that they distribute and then gather up. Don't waste anything. We'll talk about that too. He took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. That's different because the disciples are distributing it in the synoptic gospels. So I don't know why the difference there. I've not seen any good reason for those differences.
Pastor, in my King James Version, it says he gave it to the disciples,
Here in John it says that. I'm not sure. I mean, that had to be added because in the Greek it does not say that.
What was the question, Pastor?
She said in the King James that she has, it says he gave them to the disciples to distribute.
He just took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were sat down.
Yeah, that's added. And I'm sure because of what is said in the synoptics, but I'll have to look at that because I don't use King James, but now I'm interested in why that's different.
It says it in the New King James too. It says the same thing in the New King James.
I'm sure.
Distributed to the disciples.
I'm sure. The New King James rarely diverges far from what King James says. So. All right, I will look into that because that's odd. That's odd. And then in verse 12, I'm sorry, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. We talked a little bit last time about that. When God gives, especially when we're talking his grace, he gives to overflowing. And what that means is more than you need. Okay. When it says here that they had their fill, it means the same thing. Because what you find just after that is there was a lot left over. And so they had their fill. They could have had more. You ever come out of one of our potlucks and you're groaning because you ate too much, because it's so good? I shouldn't have had that last. Fill in the blank. They had their fill, and there was more. And so what does Jesus do? When they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments that nothing may be lost. This brings to mind several things. And one is when they're wandering around in the wilderness and God gives to them manna to eat, would you say that's grace? God's feeding them. They end up detesting it because it's the same thing every day, and so on and so forth. And they end up complaining like they did about just about everything else. But instead of being thankful that God is feeding them, they begin to mumble and groan against Moses and God, and begin to think, it'd have been better if we stayed in Egypt, because there we had this and this and this, and how quickly they forgot about being slaves, and groaning to God about how difficult that was. But just like with the manna, God gave specific instructions for them to gather it up. When it fell, gather it up. And they were to make use of it. Otherwise, it was going to spoil and have worms and everything else. God didn't want them to be wasteful with what he was providing. So what's Jesus having them do here? Okay. Jesus, who created all things, without him, nothing was created that has been created, is having them be good stewards of what God gives. So there's stewardship going on here in this miracle. He cares about his creation. Yes, sir. You know? I don't even know what I want. I always thought, I hope he was like first in line, you know? They gathered them up and filled 12 baskets. 12 baskets with fragments from the 5. And for whatever reason, he's specific here, barley loaves. There's significance to that I won't get into today, but it's what, I'll just say this, it's what they use for the Passover. So there's a connection there. And if you didn't know that, you wouldn't know this connection, but there's all kinds of little connections in this particular miracle that when we read it more closely, we begin to see what Jesus is connecting, both to the Old Testament and to what he's going to say and teach in this chapter. He hasn't gotten to that yet, but he's about to tell them that he's the bread from heaven, not the manna that their ancestors got. He, and they will feast on him. And in feasting on them, they will have everlasting life. And so there is a connection here in this meal that Jesus is providing that will be lasting. And so keep that in mind for next time. I'm already over time, but we will start with that, the 12 baskets left over, and the considerations for us that has. We'll close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come,